going to be robots. Or they have some sort of thing that looks like this. Now you think you're looking at a video game called Call of Duty. It's not. This is what DARPA is trying to develop. But these are all tactical solutions, but war, as we know, is not won tactically, it's won at the strategic level. We learned that in Vietnam, right? You can win every tactical engagement, every battle, but yet lose the war. But here we're investing, we're doubling down on conventional weapons with better technology. It's the very definition of insanity. For 70 years, one thing has been very clear in warfare is that technology does not matter. Luddites, technological primitives, have routinely beaten advanced technological militaries. France in Algeria or Indochina, British in Palestine and Cyprus, the Soviets in Afghanistan, the US in Vietnam, Iraq and Afghanistan, the UN as well, around the world. So why are we investing more in conventional war and technology? It seems to be idiotic. This is one of the chief culprits, the F-35 fighter jet. This plane has cost American taxpayers $1.5 trillion. Trillion. That is more than Russia's GDP on a fighter airplane. On the whole program, not the single airplane. That would be really outrageous. Wow, they should work for Lockheed. Anyway, but the point is that $1.5 trillion, but when was the last time we had a strategic dogfight? Maybe the Korean War, right? Are fighter airplanes even relevant anymore? And in 2 long wars, how many combat missions has this fighter airplane flown? Does anybody know? Zero. The measurement of any weapon is its utility. Okay, 0 combat missions. Now recently, the Pentagon or Lockheed said, oh, this looks really bad for our PR, so we're going to fly a few combat missions in Afghanistan, which they did in October or November, but it doesn't really count as combat if the enemy can't shoot back. So we're going to count those. It costs, anyone take a guess of how much it costs to fly this thing per hour? $45,000 an hour. You're going to say that? Yeah. $45,000. That's like more than the private first-class mechanic annual salary, right? So, you know, something could be wrong here, is my point. Something could be wrong. Meanwhile, it's not deterring China or Russia. It's not deterring anybody. So why are we buying more of them? So here is actually war as it is. War as it is. Russia. Manipulating elections, not just here, but the Brexit and elections across Europe. We all know that they tried to manipulate elections. The only question is, how effective were they? Was it a trifling? Did it throw an election? You know, Brexit and the US election were kind of close. That remains to be seen. I have no insight into that. But we do know that they're actively trying to manipulate elections. And it makes sense strategically. Why do you care about the sword when you can manipulate the arm that wields it? That's the strategic logic. They're also using conventional weapons, but in unconventional ways. So old rules versus new rules. This is an example. The Soviets always wanted to disunite Europe, and especially NATO, right? So in the old rules, what they would do in like the 80s or the 70s, they would have these massive military exercises on the border of East and West Germany. They'd have 150,000 Soviet soldiers, planes, everything. And they'd tell NATO, don't worry, don't freak out, it's just an exercise. And then NATO would be freaking out, because how do you know? How do you know if it's an exercise? And this would create fissures within NATO. Well, now, when the Kremlin wants to disunite Europe, it doesn't do that anymore. The utility of force in modern war is declining. What that means is the utility of force means the usefulness of force. It's being replaced by other things, sneakier things, like we saw covert units in Ukraine. Here they're using bombers in Syria, but not to destroy military targets, they're bombing civilian centers. They are creating a tidal wave of refugees that crashes upon the shores of the EU and results in the Brexit and the rise of right-wing parties, which they then pump up. Russia is weaponizing refugees. We're stuck thinking about who has the better missile system, and they're weaponizing refugees. That's the new rules of war. How about this? When was the last time you saw China as a villain in a movie? Anybody know? 10 years ago? Which movie?
All I recall is Richard Gere getting his tail.
Oh, yeah, Richard Gere got PNG'd from Hollywood. They tried to make Red Dawn 2, and that failed. You remember the story? They're like everybody remembers Red Dawn, right? A classic Patrick Swayze, classic, loosely used. Yeah, Wolverine. So somebody over here is the great American insurgency against the Soviet occupation in the 1980s. Well, they made a remake of this, I don't know, 10 years ago with the Chinese, but then they had to go back and like Photoshop all the Chinese and turn it into North Korea, which is, of course, totally implausible. But the reason is that China has bought Hollywood. Talk about strategic messaging. You cannot make a bad movie about China. They can shape the way the world views them through the world's largest megaphone, which is Hollywood. That is the new rules of war. Victory and defeat it's won in the information space, not on the battlefield. In fact, battlefield victory is obsolete. Obsolete. You know, we're looking for a USS Missouri moment with the Taliban right now. The USS Missouri, as you recall, is the battleship that Japan signed surrender in World War II. There's no such thing as a USS Missouri moment with modern foes. So that's the new ways of war. War has moved on. We have to move on as well, because even an undefeated military can lose. Rome thought itself the eternal city until it wasn't. In 410 AD, when barbarians stormed and raided the city, and the 5th century was very ugly for them. So the point of this book and why I wrote it is that we have to learn how to win in this new environment of durable disorder. It requires a new set of rules to fight by. These rules will make the traditional warrior's head explode. It's not our paradigm of warfare is still essentially the glory days of World War II, and that is what's holding us back. We are our own worst enemy. Here are 10 rules for which to combat and win warfare in the future. And they do not look like strategic rules that are currently thought about or talked about in the Pentagon or elsewhere. And with this, I'd like to turn it over to audience Q&A.
Thank you so much for that. Like I said earlier, we're going to take questions from in the room and from online, and you can also vote for questions online if you'd like one of them. All right, we'll take a question just right here up to the front. Wait for the microphone, please. Thank you.
Thanks. So how much, you talked at the start about kind of the decline of the West and the liberal order. How much of the transition in warfare do you think is a reaction to the strength of the U.S. and the system over time, and that as kind of that declines, we'll be shifting back, you think, towards a more conventional form?
So that's a good question. I get this question all the time. It's basically, has the world adopted unconventional warfare because our conventional capabilities are so strong? And to some extent, yes. But I would say that, first of all, we have to break this paradigm of there's conventional versus unconventional warfare. It's kind of curious that we use normative language to describe war. Regular war, conventional war. We all agree what that looks like, but nobody can agree what unconventional war looks like, except it doesn't look like that, right? So if you study war, there's really no such thing as conventional war as we imagine it. It's sort of, it's a norm we have absorbed. So I think to some extent that is, I don't think that is like, it's suddenly if we stop building, conventional weapons, Russia is going to do it. I think that warfare, we live in a global information age where being sneaky, avoiding cameras, being able to have plausible deniability is still more powerful than genocide. And genocide, by the way, is partly how the West was settled by the U.S. Army. So I think that we can, and also just to be clear, I'm not saying we should stop building conventional weapons, but let's slow down the pace and invest money elsewhere. Because the State Department, other places are dying on the vine, and we need to, and they also help in modern war. But it's a very good question. It's very astute. Yeah.
We'll take a question from in the back, lady in the green coat.
Thank you.
Yes.
I know you're writing about traditional rules of war and warfare, but something we talk a lot about in my work, thinking about the military and then veterans, is the future force. And as that being one of our biggest national security issues is the people that are actually serving and not wanting to join. So could you reflect on that and kind of how it plays out in the world of modern warfare?
So is your question, how do we get more people to volunteer to serve?
Or are people talking about the impact that that's actually going to have on our rules of war and how we're moving
It's a good
forward?
question. So it's actually quite a complex question. So my military mentor, I was a paratrooper in the 82nd. I had the great benefit and fortune of having Stan McChrystal as my battalion commander when I was a lieutenant. This is a long time ago. And he did me the great honor of writing the foreword. He believes strongly, as do I, in national service. And it doesn't have to be military, it could be civilian. And it would solve, there's a lot of reasons why people may not like it, but it would also solve a lot of problems. But right now, one of the things, when I'm at National Defense University, which is a war college, it's very clear to vets that they are doing most of the bleeding for this country. Less than 1% of America serves in the military, and they are frankly tired of literally taking the hits. They will always serve and they always do their duty. It's not a question of that. But there is a growing problem. And the solution has been to use contractors. So during the Iraq and Afghanistan war, let's put it this way. In World War II, only 10% of our force was contracted. In Iraq, it was 50%. And in Afghanistan, it was 70%. And when I talk to foreign journalists, they're like, well, is it going to be 90% in the future? And now we have Eric Prince, the founder of Blackwater, is pitching 100%. He's pitching a plan to replace all troops in Afghanistan with mercenaries to President Trump. And he's pitching this on simple solution to complex problem and price point. So that might happen. The reason I think we're partly involved in this is because we don't have enough Americans who serve. And because we don't have enough Americans that serve, we can be very bellicose as a nation because we don't actually have to bleed for our wars. And so that is my other concern. I wish we had more people who did serve because I think we'd be a little bit more taciturn about foreign entanglements.
I think as an extension to the point that you mentioned earlier, there's a question that came in from online is how are mercenaries legally allowed and are there any international conventions or national laws that prohibit their activities?
So it's a great question. So in this book, I do discuss the rise of mercenaries, which I think is one of the biggest destabilizing trends in the 21st century that's almost never covered. Forget ISIS, forget Russia. It's like the privatization of warfare. Because when you privatize war, it changes warfare because military strategies suddenly blend with market ones. And in some ways, we have CEOs that may be better prepared for the future war than four-star generals. There is no real legal framework to deal with mercenaries, either domestically or internationally. And worse, there's no political will. So who's going to go into Yemen and arrest all those mercenaries? It's not going to be United Nations or or the Marine Corps. And also, let's not forget that mercenaries can shoot your law enforcement dead. Okay? This is the one market. The market for force is the one market you cannot regulate, which means we can't stop it. This is what Machiavelli was complaining about in the 1520s. How it disappeared after the 30 Years' War is of great debate, and it didn't really go underground until 1850, but we can't probably recreate that situation, and we can't forget that mercenaries are the second oldest profession. They've been around for a very long time, and they're now back with us. So I'm kind of pessimistic about the utility of law to regulate this type of warfare.
Great. Take a question just right here from the gentleman in the scarf.
So, two questions, if I may. The first, I confess I don't know when your book came out, but I would like to know whether there's been any reaction, whether it's the Pentagon,
Yes.
politicians, or so on, that would react to what you're suggesting.
Yeah.
And then the second question, I get what you're saying about what we're not doing, but I don't remember hearing anything you said about specifics that we should be doing.
Okay, great, good questions. So to answer the book came out January 22nd, so just a few weeks ago. It's gotten 2 sets of very strong reactions. Combat vets and younger people generally love the book because they're like, yeah, this is what is going on. A lot of older retired colonels and generals and Lockheed Martin folks hate the book, saying, oh, you're dangerously naive and blah, blah, blah. And so there's a generational rift. That's not universal, I mean, across the board, but generally speaking, that's how it's shaking out, which is what I expected when I wrote the book. This book asks tough questions and questions that are overdue, and we need to have a national discourse about forever wars. Otherwise, we'll be doomed to them forever, and that's a choice. We do have an option here. Okay, so in the 10 rules, as you can see, rules 1 through 4 are about what we need to stop doing, breaking bad habits. Rules 5 through 10 are about what we need to start doing. And they propose specific things. So for example, I talk about shadow wars. War is getting sneakier, it's going underground. We're building aircraft carriers, the enemy is doing these sneaky things that are much more potent ultimately. We have to go underground with it, and we have to wage our own shadow wars. We've done this in the Cold War. People talk about this like it's a new thing. No, it's not. In our lifetime, we've done this. Maybe we haven't done it well. I also talk very honest about this, like Guatemala 53, Iran 53. I don't know if you recall these things, but the CIA manipulated sort of coups d'etats. And that's a problem. And one of the problems that came out of the church committee of the 70s is that democracy and secrets are not compatible. So how do we wage a shadow war if we don't want to lose our democratic soul? Autocracies can do it very easily because Putin manipulates the press and everybody else. But we can't do that. But there are things that we can do shadow war against autocracies. Autocracies are also vulnerable to this type of manipulation. And I give some specific ideas in here on how to do that. Also, how do you delegitimize virulent and nasty ideologies? We could kill ISIS all day long, but their center of gravity is an ideology that we have to work with partners in the Middle East to debunk, and we have to be a little bit more creative. It's hard to imagine, like, how do we get, our strategic communication skills in this country are terrible, but we invented Hollywood and Madison Avenue. There's no excuse for it. So our government's just not very savvy about how to deploy it and how to work with the private sector. So there's a lot of other ideas in the book specifically. They're not just sort of hand waves, but I talk about creating an American Foreign Legion for zones of disorder. I talk about swapping the reserves and the active duty in the US military, because I think we've got the exact wrong proportions. I mean, there's a lot of specific ideas, enough to make the strategic culture of the Pentagon ears perk up.
I'll take a question just right in the front row. There's a microphone just coming up.
Question is really, how do you make things change the way you'd like them changed?
Yeah, so that's a dissertation level question. No, so like the first thing you've got to do is you got to point to what the change needs to be. So right now, it's easy to get mired into a discussion of authorities and legalities and and if you do that, then you'll see it'll give up and it'll be status quo. But it's amazing too that we have had some of these problems for a very long time. And there's some, I don't know, the military-industrial complex that Eisenhower warned us about, and to some extent Teddy Roosevelt did as well. How do you fix that? All I know is that, I think that Eisenhower and Senator McCain would be rolling in their graves right now if they saw the current, Secretary of Defense, right? So I don't know how to break that. Ultimately, it comes down to Congress, and who elects Congress is us. So I think one way to your lady's question in the back is if everybody did serve, military or civilian, that might make people think more sincerely about how we wage war in the future, because right now there's not much skin in the game.
Take a question all the way in the back.
Going back to Guatemala, I recall Kermit Roosevelt, I think, bought mullahs to help overthrow the presidency. And we've had no problems episodically overturning, as you mentioned, Guatemala, Mexico, any number of countries.
Yes.
The problem is we're not consistent in being bastards. And I think to a large degree what you're advocating is some consistency in having the same tools be used that the opponents do. And
yes.
I recall that the CIA, those of us who read the 6 Days of the Condor, the CIA actually had an operation where they put disinformation on the Soviet grain harvest and create the impression of starvation. But they had to have a separate unit to then vet the information that came back from Soviet press to tell the internal echelon that, no, we put that rumor out. It's actually a false story. Isn't part of your answer here that we have to start doing, as you indicate in your 10 rules, exactly that which our opponents do, and stomach the nausea and don't publicize it, frankly? But the same token, to overcome strategic atrophy, what exactly are the first few targets? You mentioned autocracies have vulnerabilities. What is a good use of the same tools against an autocracy like Putin?
Okay, that's great. Another very compound and complex question. I appreciate that. So 3 things. So first is that this book brackets the important question of ethics in war, right? That's a separate book. It doesn't ask, should we go to war? It takes it at the position that we're at war, we're going to go to war. How do we wage it as efficiently as possible to minimize loss of life and tragedy? And it's in this way, it's identical to, say, Clausewitz's On War or Sun Tzu's The Art of War. They don't get into the normative questions of should we go to war. It's not just war theory. It's we're going to go to war, we're in war. How do we do it as efficiently as possible without glorifying it? Second, one of the things I discuss at length, and to your question too, is we need a grand strategy. We have not had a grand strategy since the Berlin Wall fell down, since containment ended. We have been strategically adrift. I talk about what a grand strategy is, how you make it, what makes it grand, and why there's so much grand skepticism in Washington today about grand strategy. People are like, it can't be done. It can be done. We're just not thinking hard enough about it. This book also makes the point that we need to invest in gray matter more than silicon. So grand strategy would rationalize some of these things about racking and stacking threats and about how to go after them. And one of the rules on here is that the most effective weapons do not fire bullets. So rather than us looking at China and the South China Sea, rather than us trying to invest in more F-35s and more submarines and more aircraft carriers, which cost $13 billion a copy before sailors and aircraft are added, which do not deter a thing and do not really stop the Chinese at all, why don't we get savvy to the new rules of war? If you want to get China out of South China Sea, you don't take them on Cold War, like World War II style. What you do is you uphold the Uyghurs in the West. You focus on rivals within the sort of the Politburo of Beijing, stuff we used to do in the Cold War. You get them focused away from the South China Sea and at domestic issues, and that's one way to defang them. Are we prepared to do that as a nation? I don't know, but are we prepared to have America kicked out of the South China Sea region? I'm not sure if that's any better. We'll have to microphone. I'll leave it to the
the microphone is just right next
to Victoria.
So one of the tools could be, rather than trying to ban oligarchs and restrict them, we co-opt them. We help a oligarch hedge fund, whatever it takes, to penetrate that level of Russian thinking.
There's a lot of, when I talk the shadow work rule chapter here, I talk a lot of these things. And the question is, when you look at a strategy, a military or any sort of national security strategy, you have to look at least 2 things. One, is it feasible? Can it work? And 2, is it acceptable to the American people? But is it acceptable that we should not assume that we're going to be the unilateral superpower forever and ever. That's wrong. We have to be honest with ourselves about the world that we face ahead of us, because right now we've had a lot more threats than we did, say, 20 years ago. So I look at some of these things in the book.
We'll take a question right here in the white sweater.
I don't mean to be a contrarian, but
yes, please
isn't peace an option here? Isn't there something, I don't see how those rules end anywhere near peace.
Yes. So the truth is we are at peace with much of the world already. We're focusing on China, Russia, ISIS, North Korea, a couple of the main threats. And that's the focus of the book. Do we have to worry about France? Do we have to worry about other places in the world? Probably not. The other thing is, if you look at rule number 3, it's a mistake to look at war or peace. It's war and peace. And this is not new, because in the Cold War we had something very similar to this. It just requires some more nuanced thinking. Those who want, and I applaud it, that would love to have like peace and stability and rule of law, it's an admirable goal, and we should continue to seek it out. But I'm focusing on like the worst parts of the world. So it's not to exclude or say it's impossible that we can, why can't we have peace with Mexico? That's not the point. Yeah. Yes.
Yep.
So I destabilize your country.
Yeah.
And the durable war goes on.
Yeah.
Durable war means there's no durable peace.
Yeah.
Because I'm continuously destabilizing.
Sure.
How do you get to peace if you're continually destabilizing?
Well, that's a great question. It depends. When you look at it, you've said, what is war? How do you know what victory is in this scenario? Victory is, what are your political objectives that you set out at the beginning of the conflict? And do you achieve those or not? And you can't move the goalpost as politicians do, because history is never fooled, right? Now, rule number 10 is victory is fungible. What this means is that there's many ways to win and lose. In a conventional war, the only way to win is killing more enemy, taking more territory, flying your flag over the capital. That's not how it works anymore. Israel tried this against Hezbollah in 2006 and lost. Okay? Look at ISIS. I mean, we've done this all, and so we agree on this. So what is the political objectives you're trying to seek? And destabilizing places, can that achieve it? Well, maybe. I mean, maybe we can do that in a place where Russia's in, destabilize it for Russia, push Russia out, and then maybe foster a democracy, not like Iraq, different model. Maybe there can be an optimistic outcome. I don't want you to think that this is just like we're going to be Dante-esque with this and make an inferno, and then at least the bad guy doesn't hold it. But it's a good question. And like the Italian wars and durable disorder, you have sort of perpetual conflict. Yeah.
We'll take a question from our student group.
Thank you. Hi. With the threat of nuclear war, how could a nuclear attack, either from North Korea onto the U.S. or the U.S. onto another state, change the global rules of war again? And moreover, how could the U.S. utilize the new rules of war to combat or prevent a nuclear attack?
So nuclear weapons is interesting because it also destroys conventional war. And thinkers in the 1950s, especially Rand and game theory, explore all this. The thing about nuclear war is that, we should not assume the nuclear taboo is going to last forever. I think there's a good chance we'll see a nuclear bomb go off in somebody's lifetime in this room. Also, this idea of, can there be a limited nuclear war? I'm thinking India versus Pakistan right now. I'm thinking of a scenario where India invades Pakistan and Pakistan uses a nuke on its own territory. Right? How would the world respond? Of course, it would open up a floodgate to using nuclear weapons, and people will view it like a big bomb. I think one way to not think about it is sort of the 1960s mutually assured destruction. That might happen, but it might not either. Also, we have things like the JDAM bomb, which is pretty darn big. So sometimes it's funny what we privilege as what's a weapon system, what versus not. But I am fearful of seeing limited nuclear war in our lifetime.
Take a question all the way in the back, right here.
So, I come from India, now live in the US, both open societies and the use of the internet to, change minds, create havoc. And what's the solution? I mean, this doesn't seem to be any solution for random mayhem in the marketplace or a synagogue or attacking.
Yes. So I discussed this again in rule number 9. I'll talk about how open societies are vulnerable to this way of warfare. All right? And we don't want to become a closed society, right? And this is traditionally what happens to democracies in wars. When democracies fight wars, they become more autocratic. And it goes back to Athens, the Peloponnesian War, and Thucydides. This is not new. Look at the U.S. during the Civil War, during Abraham Lincoln. As brilliant as he was as a strategist, how it became more autocratic. So I think one of the things we have to do is, how do we create savvier consumers of information? I don't know how to do that, but we need that. Also, I think rule number 2 here is technology will not save us. This is really about like the F-35 and our huge investments in these types of old rules of war technology. But we do need technology. We need technology that helps us become better consumers of information. So if you see clickbait, if we have a technology that says this is made in North Korea, you wouldn't click it, right? So we need more technologies like that and less technologies about how to defeat battlefield tactical environment things. So, but they're also, let's not forget that autocracies are also vulnerable, but in different ways, to this modern way of warfare. It's not just purely a one-way street against democracy, and sometimes the best defense can be an offense.
Gentleman in the gray jacket.
Thank you. You talked a little bit about the F-35 and the huge, if I may say, waste of money on something that's not particularly useful, but is presumably very, very popular with Lockheed and all of the other contractors because it makes such a large amount of money. Similarly, I think you've talked about how private military companies don't produce conclusive solutions to problems. In fact, they serve to prolong them because they're not trying to win, they're trying to continue getting paid. So my question is, can you maybe talk about how maybe profit-seeking entities are an obstacle to American interests, maybe that in a way they're not obstacles to Russian or Chinese interests, and is there a way to sidestep that?
So it's a great question. And so this is going back to Eisenhower and Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt. The whole public-private partnership is both highly useful, but also has issues that how do you use private means to achieve public sector interests, and can they work at cross purposes? And I wrote a book before this, a nonfiction book called The Modern Mercenary. It's an Oxford University Press book that talks about all the ways that some companies, not all, some companies can manipulate information, asymmetries of information to better serve their interests at the expense of their clients' interests. And this was a big issue during Machiavelli's time. And he couldn't figure it out, and nobody else could either. And I am pessimistic about what happens when we marketize warfare, because that's what's going on right now. War is becoming increasingly marketized, and I'm not talking about the US, I'm talking about like UAE. It's a lot of money to throw around. And they're creating a market for force there that could blow back through other parts of the world. And so this is, Cicero said, war is fueled by the sinews of money. I mean, this is an old problem, and I don't have a great pat solution to it. But we have to be made aware of it. And it's not just the F-35, it's much bigger than that now.
All right, we'll take a question just up here. Microphone's coming.
Try to narrow this down a little bit. So conventional war.
Yes.
We look at World War II. Everyone understood what Hitler was trying to do: Lebensraum, domination, so on. So what do you think China's end game is?
China, I think, they have a greater Han dynasty, and I mean, everybody who talks about greater China, greater Russia, greater Germany, it should be a red flag to everybody. I mean, Russia, I think, Putin has a czarist-like vision. Erdogan has an Ottoman-like vision, Sultan vision. I think China has a similar vision where they have their own Monroe Doctrine, and they want to push us out. And they actually have this thing called the three warfare strategy about how to do this, which I discussed in this book. But the three warfares are these, and it's working. One is information/influence. Another is lawfare, manipulating international law, twisting, perverting it to serve their interests. And the third is using like market forces. And look at how they, like Tony Soprano, they took over a huge port in Sri Lanka, right? This is how they're winning the world. And they're not, what's absent? Military force, right? They're playing by the new rules of war. We're stuck in World War II. But yeah, and so I think that they, and you don't have to be wealthy, or you don't have to, there's a lot of ways to play this, but that their interest, I think, is this hegemony. Like, they want to become regional hegemony, and maybe someday the world's hegemon.
Great. There's a hand up just in the back. Yep, just behind you.
How does cyber warfare, malware, viruses play into this? Because that seems like a much greater bomb than a nuclear, which would create the, the nuclear winter and all the things you and I probably both studied.
So I add a little discipline to the cyber debate. So every time you hear someone talk about cyber, not you, it's like it's jazz hands. Like, oh my God, they're going to take down all the electricity, and they've been saying that for 20 years now. If you look at the studies, rodents are a bigger threat to our electrical grid than cyber. I mean, the squirrel is this true enemy of our power grid. But this is the cyber has become like these sprinkle like fairy dust on any, like, not you, but people have these pet projects. They want to better this, they want to better that. But if you use the word cyber in it, like somehow DoD is going to throw you money, and they probably will. So unfortunately, the signal to noise ratio in the cyber debate is way out of whack. Where cyber is important, it's not sabotage. So you remember Stuxnet, like a couple years ago? That was nonsense. That did not slow down the Iranian nuclear program at all, which is why, in part, the Obama administration tried to have a nuclear deal with Iran. The real power of cyber is influence. It's influence. And all cyber does, it allows us to do old things in new ways. It allows us to do theft, propaganda, espionage, and some sabotage. But I think cyber is obviously very important, because I think in the future, war is becoming more epistemological. It's, the winners and losers will be determined by who can figure out truth from lies. And cyber has it's both a weapon and a defense in that war.
Like Brexit or the elections.
Yes. So I think Brexit elections that's a true power of cyber. It's not Stuxnet.
All right, we're going to try to take two more questions to the lady in the green. Yep.
I'll try to answer quickly.
So adding to that, could you just quickly comment on germ warfare?
Oh, well, I'm against it. No, look, germ warfare, I mean, the thing that concerns all of us is like suicide terrorist groups, suicide cults, because no rational actor would use germ warfare because it can mutate against you, right? But during the 1980s, the U.S. invested in huge germ warfare programs that were designed to take out entire countries. I mean, it's really lethal and abhorrent. I hope that some suicide cult does not invest in this. But I don't, I don't know. I don't know how hard it is to create those types of germs if it's really expensive, because there are cheaper ways to do harm in the world. So how do you? I mean, to be very, I know we have another question, but so yeah, I hopefully won't see it. Not the main focus of the book. Yeah.
Well, we'll take a question right here.
Going back to your original explanation of how we got into the durable disorder, to what extent is the United Nations culpable for creating a situation that enables countries like Russia and China to employ the tactics they're employing right now?
Yeah, well, I think Russia and China, I think the United Nations will be basically, it's impotent right now. I mean, if you look at the Crimea, if you look at the Middle East, I mean, the UN's role, if you look at, we don't have time for the history of the UN, but there's a pre-Cold War UN, there's post-Cold War UN, the failures of the Balkans, the failures of Rwanda, and now in the Chapter 7 missions and R2P, and I think nobody takes the UN seriously anymore. That maybe for certain things like climate change, they can be a great actor, but in terms of mitigating armed conflict, and their initial mission was to stop a World War III in Europe. And that way they were successful. But I'm pessimistic in them being able to control and mitigate. And I spent a lot of time with the UN in Africa. And if you look at Darfur, if you look at the Congo, there's not many success stories to be told there.
And actually, we have 1 minute left, so I will take one more question. The gentleman with his raised hand.
So in this new context, how do you see the future of international coalition when we see the result of Libya or Afghanistan and Iraq?
So I think international coalitions are important, but why do we limit them just to states? We live in a post-Westphalian era where Fortune 500 companies are more powerful than most states in the world. So why don't we have a more complex and robust form of coalitions, and it's not just purely like Napoleonic state-on-state diplomacy and warfare. And that's what this book argues for. It's a much more nuanced vision of international relations.
Great. Well, that's all the time that we have. Sean McFate's book is for sale. It's going to touch on all this and many more. So please join me in thanking Sean. Thank you.